Okay, folks, we're going to get started. We're going to ask all panelists and participants to stay on mute. We're going to do our best to control that and stay off video as well. In addition, we're going to make sure that the folks talking can do their best to have their audio on and their video on. So with that, we have Flo from the impact team here at Boulder. Going to be sort of managing things in the background. So if you have any questions, feel free to post them in chat, and Glo will make sure that we get all those. Thanks everyone for attending, especially on short notice. We appreciate you all being here. First and foremost, I know this was a fireside chat, so I wanted to make sure that I had a fireplace behind me. One of the great good night moon. It's officially a fireside chat. With that, I'll do a little bit of background. So my name's Steve. Like any good host, my job is to make sure everyone here feels invited, welcome, comfortable, essential to the event that we're having. So I'm keeping virtual cups and bellies full today. That's sort of my job. And if I do my job well, like nobody will remember me, but everyone will remember our participants and the discussion. I'm currently the president and board chair at Boulder. We're a mission-driven outsourcing company, which means we invest our time and a percentage of our profits into the communities where we operate and serve. We believe companies like ours can play a positive role in global development, especially in the future, by focusing on economic development, education opportunities, and mostly equipping people around the world to access opportunities they've never had access to before. So that's a little background why Boulder is hosting this. Today's discussion came about quickly. We've been asking this question, and given our mission-driven focus, aren't hearing as much as we wanted to on this topic. So we decided to pull some friends and happen to be experts, or some experts who happen to be friends, together to share their perspectives. We pulled this together quickly. Perspective is a small conversation, and we're nice to see a bunch of folks have hopped on, and we're going to make this content available via email and a blog post as well, so you can share it if you find that interesting. So again, thanks for letting me go through my introduction. I appreciate it. We hope other discussions on the topic. And with that, the further and further back I will start to step. So with that as a baseline, I want to start by having our panelists and the experts and friends introduce themselves. So I'm going to virtually tap you on the shoulder. I'm going to ask you to share your name, the organization you're with, why this topic is important to you, and then one piece of advice, something you've done to make working in this new environment a little bit more palatable, if not productive. So let's go around the horn. Let's start with you. You do name, organization, why this topic is important to you, and some piece of advice.
Hello. My name is Jessica Herrera, and I work for Plan International as a regional officer for Americas, focusing on youth employment and solutions. Thank you so much for the invitation. I think this topic is incredibly relevant, and having spaces like this to just learn from each other and be able to share different practices that we can bring back to our day-to-day in this new normal. One practice that has worked for me has been in our regional team, we have a chat every Friday in the morning for 30 minutes that it's not work related at all. We just talk about our challenges, how we can help each other, and then just have like a more human conversation that's not related to numbers, deliverables, tasks. So we just talk about, how's your week? Are you being productive? How we can help. So these are the spaces that we actually have to support each other. So that's been helpful for us.
Great. Just 30 minutes of good human interaction. I think that makes sense. We've already heard it. Greg?
Thanks, Sunit, and thanks for Boulder for organizing this. Really appreciate it. My name is Greg Alberry. I'm the president and CEO of Consuela Foundation, and we're a foundation that looks at the well-being of children, women, families, communities, and we do it through the lens of looking at the prevention and treatment of neglect and abuse. We work only in Hawaii and the Philippines are the two places we work. Why is this topic interesting? Two reasons. I think you're just seeing like a huge increase in vulnerability among people given the shutdown. So I think that vulnerability is something we need to, that requires immediate attention. And also I think because of the disruptions that it's caused on such a scale, there's an opportunity here. So those are the two things that interest me about it. And I think one of my tips, this is the time for creativity. You know, like seriously, we, you know, as a team, it's time to think differently. So I think, you know, just among our team, Haiku Tuesday, share a poem, do something like do the TikTok dance, you know, together for the team, do things, just be creative. And I think there's a fear that the funding will dry up for those things. So I think we need to kind of look that way.
That's great. I love it, Greg. I want to see your TikTok dance. I'm gonna follow up with you on that one. So that'd be great. With that, let's go to Manmeet.
Sure. Hello, everyone. And Sunit, thanks to you and the Boulder team for bringing us all together to have a conversation, just sort of lift up from the day to day. My name is Manmeet Mehta, and I work at Ashoka as the Director of Program Operations and Impact. Ashoka has been doing the work of systems change for 40 years now around the world, and we essentially at our core, we find and support systems changing ideas and entrepreneurs around the world. There are today 4,000 plus Ashoka fellows in more than 90 countries around the world. And it's an interesting role we play both as sitting at the intersection of funding, because we give our fellows small grants, but also we have to raise funds, and then we have our own programming for sort of systems transformation. So both as a system funder and practitioner. I think one of the things that immediately happened, both within Ashoka and then I'm starting to see around us, is sort of a recognition of both the human connection that this moment has revealed to us. There are, you know, borders and countries are false constructs. So our response may differentiate on these constructs, but this moment, this pandemic is truly global and affecting all of us. And so I think pausing to recognize the human and to find the joy. So our team does, you know, similar to what you were saying, just a conversation, just 30 minutes where we're not talking about work. We're just talking about whatever we want to talk about. Some people are talking about, gosh, this sucks, or some people are sharing funny stories. And, you know, to your point of creativity, is just like, what are the rediscovering the joy in unexpected places? So we do a watercolor workshop for, you know, we've invited Ashoka fellows in the US, and our team's based in the US. So we have a watercolor workshop with a local artist from Wisconsin. And so that's been really fun. But I think the human connection and recognizing that and sort of trying to refocus on optimism has been one of the things that has stood out, and I think is helpful.
That's great. The emphasis on the human connection is outstanding. David?
Hello. Hi. Sunit, thanks for putting this together, and thanks for connecting all of us. My name is David McKay. I'm communications specialist with the United Nations Capital Development Fund. We are the capital investment agency of the United Nations that focuses primarily on the world's 47 least developed countries, the LDCs, basically working to unlock public and private finance for these countries, and doing it in the context of local finance, digital finance, and investment finance. And I'm sure I'll get into that a little bit more as we proceed. On your question, I have an institutional answer and a personal answer. Institutionally, I think we've been leaning more into internal communications than we probably did before. In fact, definitely more than we've done before. And so that includes not only having virtual town halls where the senior management is talking to the organization as a whole, which doesn't happen that often, and now we're doing that with more consistency. But even something like a weekly newsletter that we have, where people are reading about other people's in the organization, about how they're coping, how they're dealing. Sometimes it's a funny video, sometimes it's a song, sometimes it's a prayer, but I think it gives a sense that they can feel a bit more emotionally safe in the context of the organization. And then from a personal standpoint, I think it's just keeping your eyes open to really the remarkable innovation that we're already seeing that's coming online or soon to come online in response to this crisis. And I would be remiss if I didn't say this, as a proud alum of Rutgers University, and Sunit is as well, I'm incredibly proud that our university patented or had FDA approval for a saliva test for the virus. I mean, that is going to be one of the most important achievements in the history of the institution. And I have to consciously keep my eyes open to stories of that nature. So yeah, that's how I do it.
That's great. Thanks, and always go Rutgers. Bo, you've been remote the whole time. So what's your take? Introduce yourself. And now that everyone's remote, how's it affecting you? What's your take?
Yeah, sure. Hey, everybody. Bo Percival here from the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. If I accidentally say Plan, it's because I actually used to work at Plan and I used to work with Jess. So there's a good chance I'm going to slip up somewhere in this meeting while it's on recording. But now working for the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. The question's a good one. I mean, it's kind of, I saw this great meme when all this started. It's like the realization when everybody's COVID life is my everyday life. And it was kind of like, yeah, like this is what I do every day. One of the greatest things though has been seeing people adapt to the new working conditions, because it's made for some hilarious things that have popped up on Zoom meetings, people turning themselves into potatoes, like all that kind of stuff. So I've really appreciated this, like, hey, welcome to this world, and like, let's all adjust together. I think in terms of like the overarching questions, like why this is meaningful, one of probably, this might sound as a controversial thing, but one of the things I really think this, like COVID doesn't discriminate, and therefore it makes it the most inclusive pandemic that we've kind of faced for a very long time, which means that we're bringing everybody together. So no one's kind of left out. Therefore, it is something that includes everyone. And why this topic is particularly meaningful is because then anybody could have an answer that might solve a problem. Maybe not the overarching problem, but some problem that we're all facing. And that means no matter where you are on the planet, no matter what you do, no matter what your organization, company, anything like that, anybody can contribute to part of the solution or a solution day to day. So I think for me, that's why this is meaningful, because being able to meet with everybody else that's working in different places means that I get to hear about different ways that people are solving problems in their space and how we could adopt that. The final one, like my little hack or tip, my partner actually works at WHO. So we have to instill what we call NOVID moments in our house. And these are moments where you're not allowed to talk about COVID. You can't bring it up. You can't do anything, but like, it's like gardening time, cooking, this kind of stuff, and just blocking out time that is absolutely NOVID, 100%.
Great.
I'm curious if we can do a quick round of where everyone is based right in this moment.
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me go for it.
I'm in Washington, D.C. right now.
Okay. David?
I'm in New York.
I'm in Panama.
Greg?
I'm in Hawaii.
And Bo?
Just outside of Geneva in France.
Perfect. And I'm in New Jersey. And Glo and Erwin are in the Philippines. Great. So good. I mean, great. Talk about inclusion. You talk about how anyone, anywhere, or everyone, everywhere can participate and make an impact. Let's talk about the first time people confronted COVID, their organizations and themselves. And speaking of that, everyone, everywhere, given how distributed the fellows are, can you talk to us about, the first time your organization started thinking, Ashoka started thinking about COVID-19?
Sure. I think there were a few threads of parallel work sort of starting to come together. From an organizational point of view, there was the coming together of what we call a team of team structure. It's like not any one team, but someone from talent and from one country in Europe, and different teams. Somebody coming together to form a team of these larger teams, and say, look, what's happening, and thinking about staff well-being, thinking about fellow well-being, thinking about organization, like as an organization, how should we respond? But to your point on how distributed the fellow network is, it was actually, became clear quite rapidly that it was going to allow us sort of bird's eye view into community responses. One of the things we've seen is news isn't equally reliable from everywhere around the world, and we're not necessarily hearing all the right stories. And so the fellows became really powerful nodes around the world, sort of lifting up the voices of communities and how communities were springing into action in response to COVID. And it's been interesting because we fund fellows that are doing systems changing work, right? But there is a spectrum of work, and so you have somebody that works in the open source community, for example, in Spain, that decided that after a couple of weeks in lockdown that they've got to respond. So there's sort of this view of what is the best way to invite the community to step into roles of change making instead of passive spectators to this experience that we're all undergoing. And so they sort of mobilized a coronavirus maker forum, and they're 3D printing ventilators and other equipment and on calls with local hospitals and figuring out what is needed. So we started to see those kinds of stories bubbling up, and I think acting as really powerful pieces of information when people are figuring out how should we organize our responses, both in the immediate and then as we now start to think about the future, what are these foundations that are being laid out for a new world?
That's great. And I guess speaking of that sort of bubbling up and the origin, Jess, talk about plan and how early you all started thinking about it, which I think may be among the earliest in this group.
I think at first Plan started seeing it more as a regional intervention. I don't think anyone in this place expected this to go global this fast. I sit in Panama, but my team is actually in the Philippines. So I was aware that all these measures were being taken in place. A lot of the WHO recommendations were being considered. Some travel was being restricted, and also the most vulnerable points in the organization, which are our communities, were also being analyzed to, if this were to go like up to scale, what would happen and how we could still be able to support our communities. But particularly our region, it was impacted when the case reached Brazil. Our security advisor is Italian, so from the moment that this exploded in Italy, he was very aware in trying to implement all these early measures. So the travel was suspended. The community work was temporarily on hold, just to see how we could still, support our communities without bringing the risk to the communities. So as an organization as a whole, it was actually March when the work from home was implemented, but it was also going back to our strategy, because Plan's mandate is to be with the most vulnerable. So the core of our work is to be able to support girls and young women and to make sure they're safe. So it was also going back to our strategy and finding ways that we could still support them without putting them into risk. So we had to reevaluate a lot of the programs. Each country went into writing their own emergency response plan, into analyzing what can we do, how can we support, what's our capability, how can we collaborate with the government. So some countries were focused more on behavioral change and the communication aspect, and some were focused more on supporting the health sector and like the hygiene, delivering hygiene kits, for example. My work specifically, since I work more on the youth employment side, it's been trying to find ways in that we can still build the resilience of the communities, of young entrepreneurs, of all those young people that were part of our programs that right now are their own holds, just to try to build that resilience in the meantime while we can't directly involve them in the programs.
That's great. And we've heard a few conversations about the World Health Organization, and you talked about sort of the organization monitoring and following the WHO. David, you all have similar experience at the UN, started with the WHO, obviously.
Yeah.
Way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so when particularly early this year in January, as the situation was developing, of course, to your point, we are one agency within the larger UN system. So we were following WHO's lead at the time, and obviously still now. And obviously even more so now, that has made its way up to the Secretary General. So when we talk about UNCDFs response, it's really in the context of a larger UN response and a larger UN value proposition in terms of a COVID-19 response. Having said that, I think once it became clear that there could be, and frankly we're seeing it now, real impact in the context of LDCs, including Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Asia Pacific. That's obviously where we were starting to think about how we can repurpose our capacities. And the reason for that was, I mean, it's twofold. Number one, for obvious reasons, when you talk about the LDCs, these are countries that are the most susceptible, or likely the most susceptible to the virus, because they have inadequate health systems. They typically have inadequate local finance systems to support a robust COVID-19 response. But what also became clear to us is that there's also a connection between the impacts of COVID-19 and the Sustainable Development Goals, which for us is really the prism with which we view our mission. And just in a very easy example of that, when you look at economic growth among LDCs last year, it was at about 7%, which outpaced global growth. But what most development economists will tell you is that you need a higher rate of growth if we're going to achieve SDG 1 of eliminating extreme poverty. Now, obviously, every economic forecast indicates that we're going to have economic contraction this year. And for how long? I mean, we're just kind of in a black box in that regard. So we're talking really not just about the immediate economic impact, but really the potential to undercut the SDG agenda. And if we don't get that economic growth that we need, we're looking at a potential future where maybe a third of the LDC population will live in extreme poverty. So from an agenda that was focused on eliminating extreme poverty, we now have to consider interventions to ensure that we don't have, in fact, the maintenance, if not the uptick of it, because of COVID-19. So yeah, so the journey, the journey was, I think it was, it started slow, then all of a sudden, I think, is the old Hemingway line. But it's actually just been very fast, and it continues to be fast.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that. I think it's and that's fascinating. Going how the priorities change from like elimination to now mitigation, right? Which is powerful. I mean, Greg, you see this in Hawaii and in the Philippines, where you sort of have a diversity and wide range of infrastructures and problems and challenges. So how did you all approach this, and how were you affected by this at the outset?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was first just looking at the travel and the spread. And I think, just as a full disclosure, I actually lived in Vietnam during SARS and just afterwards, and done H1N1. So it wasn't totally like unfamiliar to me. Like I was kind of, and in the risk category of all that, I have a pretty high tolerance for risk. So it was mainly at first just sharing information with people and making sure they felt comfortable doing their own personal risk analysis with travel, and how comfortable do you feel? What are your health issues? You know, looking at things like that. But then as Jessica was saying, as it began to spread faster and faster, and you were just like, oh my gosh, we're really not ready for this. And I think then it became as a kind of foundation that funds. We have about 50 partners, I guess we fund in both places. It's really one taking, reassuring them, because I think they're very worried about their funding, their communities, their life. So just taking a reassuring tone with them and really looking at sort of letting know there's flexibility and how are we going to kind of get to the end mark here. So I think that's sort of where we went at it.
Great. I love hearing about the focus on values, focus on sort of recommitting to values and priorities, reevaluating. All that stuff is great. And I think, Bo, that resonates with you. Some of your feedback was, instantly we turned to the community that was impacted, and we wanted to respond to community needs. Can you talk a little bit about that, having that clarity?
Yeah, for sure. So for those that haven't come across Humanitarian OpenStreetMap, like essentially we do mapping through OpenStreetMap, which is open source map. It's kind of like Google, but totally open source, and anyone can contribute. If you imagine like Wikipedia and Google had a baby, this is what OSM is. And so for our organization, we have a volunteer base of about 200,000 members of our community who are out there like actively mapping for areas in crises. I think the thing that really caught us off guard was we're very good at fast response, and this was a slow burn. So it was very much like, when do we get into it? Like our communities were impacted. Some of the hot communities were kind of saying, what can we do? How can we contribute? And there's a lot of people who were then shut inside. So they wanted to kind of contribute remotely or be able to help others. And so we kind of were getting a lot of requests, but we didn't know how to respond to them. And I think that was coming from our community first and foremost, our own staff, the projects that we run, and then a lot of our private sector partners as well. And we wanted to be able to respond, but knowing that everybody is responding, we also didn't want to do anything that was like, redundant or duplication. And so I think one of the great things about the way HOT's set up is that it's a very decentralized community-led organization. So the first project we actually did was very local. We provided a kind of quick grant to a group in Cusco, and we enabled them to define what their need was, and that was emergency services, mapping for that purpose, and then they could get that going. So it was like, very much like from the ground led in our response. And we're in a full activation, but the difference for us as well with this one is it's a very extended one. Like a normal activation for us would be like 6 months, maybe max. We react quickly and we help mobilize really quickly. But for this, we've announced 12 months. So yeah, it's kind of like it's a slow burn and taken off, and we're just trying now to be there for the long term.
Great. We talk about activation from the ground up. Again, this sort of takes me logically to the meet and talking about, okay, so now we're in this normal, clear discussion of like, how people became aware of this and what their reactions were. You quickly shift to action, and talking about from the ground up in the meet, talk about how Ashoka, those first actions, those first priorities that these forcing functions like COVID can create. What were some of the first steps you took upon hearing about it and realizing the seriousness of it?
I'll talk about sort of the external facing pieces. I think that's, if I understand, that's sort of more what you're asking, Sunit. I think the first step really was for us to pause and just say, okay, what is the value we can contribute in this moment? So there, unlike a lot of other organizations, we don't work directly in community. So what is it that we can do when the immediate response needs to be in community? And so, and how can we help those that are responding. So I think there was a moment of just reflection and saying, okay, look, we need to understand where we can provide the most value and not be in the way. And I think sort of from there, we started to reach out to fellows. And I think that's the immediate thing that happens is like, okay, we have a network of fellows spread around the world, and we want to understand what's happening. We want to understand how the fellows are, their well-being, but also how their communities are responding and how they are responding, and sort of started to learn about all of these creative ways in which they were pivoting in order to continue their work, and in which they were pivoting for the moment just to say, look, we've got to take care of each other in our communities. And in that sort of moment of learning and hearing from them, we're still figuring out the answer, but that's where we found our sort of focus a little bit, is saying, how can we amplify these stories? How can we amplify this work, lift up these solutions that are working? Because like you said earlier, there is so much information and there's so much noise. So, when we're coming across these ideas that are actually working, creating values, how can we lift up? And also in doing so, for example, Eric Dawson runs an organization called Peace First. He's an Ashoka fellow, and he works with young communities around mediation and peace building. And he launched a fund. And he said, look, we have young people all over the world that are starting to step into roles of how can we contribute to this moment. And so you also have fellows that are saying, how can we help others to be able to activate? So he set up a small fund where young change makers can apply, whether they're running errands for the elderly, whether they want to try and support something in their community, so they can apply to that fund. You have fellows like Aijen Poo, who runs the National Domestic Workers Alliance, that works with care workers and that works with domestic workers. And if you've seen Roma in the last couple of years, you've known about some of this work. And she's saying, look, these are people that take care of us when we need it. And so now is the time for us to take care of them. So she's sort of put together a fund for, to provide immediate relief and support to these care workers that are being failed by systems that are collapsing around them, that are not being caught up in the welfare systems, that are not accessing relief. So we started to learn about these stories, and we started to ask ourselves, like, what is the best way in which we can both share these stories in a way that is accessible to those that are able to directly support them, those that are able to also be inspired and act, and that just really stories of optimism in a moment that is really bleak. And then slowly we're starting to look to the future and say, okay, these fellows that have the trust of the communities in which they work, they're already starting to reimagine. There is no going to normal. There is never going to be a return to normal. We will endure and pass this moment, but it is highly unlikely to imagine we will go back to what normal was 2 months ago, normal ways of working and producing and consuming. And so that's what we're starting to think about now. And it's very much an open question as we step into, like, what are ways in which we can contribute to sort of helping.
That's great. I love the emphasis on optimism. Let's stay on the external, and then we'll shift to the internal, because I know Greg and Jess, you all really had to take some strong actions internally as your sort of first reaction. So we'll stay on the external. And we heard about optimism. Bo, you talked about this concept. You shared with me this idea of the digital humanitarian. You touched on Peru a little bit more, but can you define that term and tell a story about it?
Yeah, sure. I definitely cannot take any credit for the term, just in case those that watch who coined it. But yeah, essentially the idea of the digital humanitarian is, for HUD, it kind of started during Haiti. With OpenStreetMap, anybody can contribute to it. And when a lot of these kind of crises happen, everybody wants to do something. So my personal family was affected by the bushfires, and in Australia over Christmas, and during that time, like everyone wanted to be there and do something. So it's kind of taking that concept into the digital space, and I think that makes what HUT does quite unique, because in a time like we're in now, where people want to actually do something where they can see a tangible contribution to the solution, the digital humanitarian is someone who could be in quarantine jump online, pick up some satellite imagery, and make some mapping of areas that have never been mapped before, which means health services could access people in remote areas, for example. So the digital humanitarian is really about this concept of like, we all want to do something. Sometimes it's send money, sometimes it's send something else. But all of us on this call know that like it's kind of a pretty thin line between doing something that's good and helpful and doing something that kind of creates more problems than we started with. So for Heart, we're very well positioned that people can make that contribution, do it digitally, and we're in the perfect, so to speak, like it's the right place and time, that everybody is at home doing something remotely, and this is the way that we can contribute. So for us, what we wanted to do is, the first thing is promote that, not just like what Hot's going to do and how we're going to solve the problem, but also promote and strengthen those people to say, hey, we know you've got a lot of time on your hands. Why don't you help out somebody else by helping mapping a community that doesn't exist or something along those lines?
Great. So we have sort of nimble responses, and then David, you're with the UN, and for you, there probably had to be a little bit more orchestrated and about to rethink of the UN and value statements in response to. Can you share a little bit of that you all had to go through?
Yeah, so while we are part of a large legacy institution, the onus was still on UNCDF to craft a response. And so the first part of that was, okay, what's our value proposition? And literally having to determine that. And I think that basically involved two processes. And number one was repurposing, because while I completely agree with Bo in terms of digital, I mean, it's levered. It's really a lever that is going to drive so much of what we're going to be doing in terms of COVID-19 response. I'll give you an example. Pre-COVID, we were probably supporting companies creating chatbot capability so that someone in a last mile market or an LDC can get educated on financial health. So now we repurpose and say, okay, if we know this space, how can we do that in order to now leverage chatbot technology for advancing public health guidance? If we were supporting a ride-sharing company before COVID in the interest of driving financial inclusion, today, what we have to do is leverage our support of ride sharing so that we can maintain supply chains so that we can actually maintain jobs and financial inclusion within them. So that was one huge part of how we were developing the value proposition. It was the repurposing. And then I think the second part of it was the speed. It was, okay, we have to craft solutions that could be deliverable and deployable in days, not even weeks or months. We have to be able to deliver that as a value prop. And so, for example, a major part of our work involves capitalizing small and medium-sized enterprises in these markets, because these are the SMEs that are too large for microfinance and too small for institutional finance, and they just kind of get stuck. And now there's an even more dramatic problem, which is that they're just shuttering and they're closing down. And so we are working on a capital deployment capability where we can go from a grant application to capital disbursement in 14 days, which we didn't do before. But now we have to, because it's a universal point. I mean, if you're a small business in New York or if you're a small business in the LDCs, every day that you can't generate revenue, you're more and more in an existential place. And so we had to develop our capabilities for given the necessity of speed. So definitely repurposing and speed was pretty much driving how we were crafting the value proposition.
Awesome. It's amazing how the word need has sort of reclaimed its true status of what's essential and what's necessary. So great discussion on the external. I do want to talk about the internal, because organizations are deeply affected. We had to flip 300 people from in office to working remotely in days. And again, the extraordinary efforts the Boulder team went through to make that happen in the Philippines. I don't know, like emotional even now just talking about it, the work that the team did. Greg, talk to me a little bit about, you talked about some of the first things you prioritize as being internal decisions. Can you share some of those?
Sure, and just really enjoyed everyone's comments so far, and especially the ideas of reflection and re-envisioning. I think those are really, and digitizing, those are kind of keywords that are sticking out for me. But I think for us, again, it's just getting in place quickly the logistics and things, and making sure, payroll and banking and partner, all the kind of nuts and bolts of your business can run remotely. So there was a lot of that. I think, so, putting all those systems in place was a high priority for us. Also, like, just when people are at home, I think one of the kind of things we've been working on is how do you build capacity of our staff from home now? Like, many of them are working in different ways. So we've set up a system with LinkedIn Learns for online learning for all our staff and all our partner staff, that they can take courses that really do things like that. So we're looking for ways to kind of engage people in a different way and do things perhaps that they didn't have time to, or maybe were not prioritized before. So trying to be creative in that space a little bit. And then I think just in the philanthropic community in both the Philippines and Hawaii, just trying to kind of look differently and work differently together in those spaces. So we're setting up platforms in Hawaii that link need and philanthropic donations quicker, more efficiently. Given it in the Philippines, we're working with the philanthropic community to do different stuff to kind of see what the issues are for them. So that's kind of internally, and that internally that like changes roles of people a little bit and how they focus their time. So we're seeing kind of shifts in roles too.
Got it. I think that's great. And the development opportunities for our own team members is huge here. How do we manage mental health and help people be productive and healthy as they navigate through this? That is our job as as bosses, as employers, whatever it might be. You talked about different different needs. Jeff International had a variety of different needs based on country offices and operating in different parts of the world. What can you tell us about how different teams had to react based on different mandates?
From our case, I think there were certain levels in the organization that were more used to working remotely or mobile. The regional teams, senior management, people that are more used to being at the office. I think that wasn't as much as the challenge as it was people that work directly in the communities, that maybe they hadn't done this before, or they were a little bit lost and confused, like, okay, so if I work remotely or if I work from home, like, how can I still support the community? So it definitely took a pause, and then just trying to communicate and really like go back to our core and being like, it's not us changing as an organization, but it's just changing our approach. So our mandate, it's the same, it's just our activities will temporarily change and our priorities will change as well. So as David was saying, we had to repurpose. Some grants were repurposed, and then just where are we needed today and what's the immediate response that we need, but also not overlooking that even if certain activities are not needed specifically today, we will need them tomorrow. So looking into the youth employment programs, for example, we're really focusing on what are the digital tools that we're going to be needing tomorrow in order to better support our communities. And it's not specifically going into what's going to be the latest technology that's going to help us, but it's at some points it's also simplifying. It's how do we reach those remote communities that don't have access to internet. So there's been a lot of analysis of like SMS, is it reached through SMS? So we're trying to simplify our content. So can we still do capacity building through text messages? Can we still call our beneficiaries to keep them connected? Is there a way that we can simplify the content that we were going to deliver in person through WhatsApp messages if that's reached. So it's been really trying to stick true to our core at what Plan does best, which is working with the communities without having to necessarily all of us be there, because there's work being done with the governments in order to consider certain plan staff essential to be able to be in the communities with the proper equipment. But the reality is not all of us can be there, and not all of the response is immediate today, but it's definitely looking a step further and like being able to still support our communities tomorrow. So having that mentality of constantly evolving and constantly adapting to the changes that COVID is presenting us.
Great. So we have about 10 more minutes. I want to get through one question. And so I'll ask everyone in the interest of time, I think keep your responses to like, 60, 90 seconds in that general range, because I want to get through everybody on this one last question. So we've talked about how we got here. We've talked about first actions, and much of that has bled into now, the actions of now. There's this idea of, we've talked about hopefulness, optimism, and reemergence, right? What does the future hold? And what thoughts do you have on that in terms of operating against it, and making progress against it? And I'll sort of work through the team and try and a flow here, but I'd love to start, Jeff, I'd love to start with you in terms of reemergence and variability of reemergence. What do you have to say about how organizations, mission-driven organizations, can think about reemergence after COVID?
I think the definition of reemergence is going to vary depending on the organization and your involvement and how your operations changed. I think it's going to be gradual. I don't think it's gonna be one day to another we change from one activity to the other. So I think it's just gonna have that mentality and that flexibility that our work might be changing every day. So I think reemergence is gonna take time, and it's gonna be gradual, but it's definitely gonna be contingent to the restrictions you have in the country, and also the trust outside to be back in the outside world again.
That's huge. I think people think that systems can just turn on and off, but it's that human confidence and faith in taking that next step as well that we have to coach through. So I think you're spot on, Jeff. Greg, I think you share a similar mindset. There's contingency, there's variables. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, sorry, truck going by. I very much agree with Jess. I think it's going to be a long-term process until kind of we understand this virus and this real risk associated with it and how to control it or work around it. But I think the things we're thinking about as we reemerge, or I guess the kind of principles, I think that we would, and I think we touched on them a lot here. I think connection, like how do we make new and existing connections with different people, I think is a principle we'll really look at. I think flexibility, like knowing that it's going to take time. We really need to think flexibly on how we work. I think well-being in the sense of health, but and what people are doing now. But I also think, at least in the space where we work with neglect and abuse, it's really bad right now what people are experiencing, and so we really, how do we protect well-being now? How do we protect it and heal from it afterwards? So that's another one. And I think the final one that I would just add that we're thinking about a lot is sustainability. And I think this is the longer term piece, but I think these connections that we form now and this re-envisioning of the future, I think the inequity and unequal systems are just so glaring right now that I think this is the opportunity to kind of look at the development industry, look at the sectors of business and stuff. Like, what are we doing that we really need to do differently now? And now's the opportunity.
Need. I agree. And you talked, and Greg, one of the things you put emphasis on was now. And Amit, I know you have a strong point of view on the term now.
Someone said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So we are here, but not, you talk about sustainability. Greg. And one of the things I was reading is how these challenges are not going away. Our focus is on one thing right now, but they're also interrelated. So there are now some new studies that are coming out to show the connection of poor air quality, and inevitably air quality is poorer in more low-income areas, is directly related to an increased incidence of COVID and sort of negative outcomes of COVID. Similarly, obesity. And so I don't know, and I don't think anyone can say. Clearly we're hearing different things and different dates and different timelines, and they vary by country and context. We don't know when this moment will pass, but I do think we all agree it will, and I do think that the time is now to think about that. Because we are in this moment, this is dorking out for a minute, but there's the Overton window, right, where we can truly consider radical ideas that were too radical. When we were talking about universal basic income as this radical idea, and now increasingly it's a real option being explored around the world. So we have these structural inequities that are in sharp and harsh highlight in this moment. And we have people that are embedded in communities, that are working in communities, just looking at the screen right now around the world. And so now is the time to say, okay, how might we reimagine this, and how might we build this together? And that's the sort of the second piece is, I think, there needs to be a more equitable and empathetic and compassion-driven framing in how we rebuild and reimagine these systems that are meant to serve us and protect us for the future.
I think it's great. And it is interesting to see a lot of the momentum around topics that even 3 to 6 months ago were breaking some, U.S. presidential candidates' aspirations are now at the forefront. It's fascinating how quickly things actually do move. We talked about frameworks, but there's also, surge and response. Bo, we want to talk a little bit about what you can share on your perspective of emergence in the future.
Yeah, sure. Reason Sunit's saying that is because if I say anything that goes against WHO recommendations, I'm going to be in trouble on two fronts. One, when I go downstairs, and also professionally. I think one of the things that is, I guess, unique about this is that normally when it comes to humanitarian response, we do have a surge, and then there's kind of a clear way out of that. Like once we've provided response and we move into recovery, and it's been practiced very well by a lot of humanitarian organizations. And like I know Plan, for example, has like a different color scale that they know, like we're in orange and we're going to red and then we're back into yellow and blue. And I think with this one, no one knows what that scale looks like or the time bounds that sit there within that scale. So we're kind of like moving from this surge role to get everybody on board to an ongoing, like longer term support role. I think the other thing that will be really interesting, and we work with a lot of, I'm not allowed to disclose who, but like a lot of big tech companies. And what we've realized, and I would say maybe, Sunit, you are going to have a lot more competition on your hands in the future with mission-driven organizations like Boulder, is that never before have these massive commercial organizations had to focus on a mission like this. Like they've always been focused on like their own internal mission. Let's like achieve this goal. Now my cynicism is going to come in, make lots of profits and all the rest of it. But now everyone's like turned it. I mean, we look at the contract tracing app that's being worked on between Apple and Google. Like when has that happened before? And I think what's really exciting about the next part of, I'm not going to take a guess at when it happens, but when it does, the reimagining is a good word. Like, but there's going to be a new of like these organizations that haven't been mission driven are going to be working a lot more in that sense. And even the ones that we're working with, by taking a humanitarian approach or that kind of focus on improving conditions or livelihoods, etc., these companies are achieving their internal missions as well. And it's this really great twist of thinking for them. It's like we used to just focus on profit and talk about like triple bottom line or whatever you want to call it. Now that actually feeds into our profit. So we're going to have to be a lot more focused on this. So I'm hoping this momentum maintains, and I get very excited about the fact that every organization is going to need to be mission driven because we've faced something like this together.
Love it. Oh, we'll take it off. Well, the benefit of being on this side is a zero-sum game. We'll take all the mission-driven players we can take. David, do you want to talk a little bit about how you all see how the UNCDF is talking about sort of this reemergence?
Yeah, and I'll move quickly. I first off, I have no clue. But I think this, from UNCDF standpoint, I think this question actually ties into the last question, in the sense that what do local governments need now? They need technical assistance to determine how they can finance their COVID responses. We're doing that. What do SMEs and vulnerable communities need? They need digital payments so that they can withstand the storm financially. We're doing that. What do businesses need just to kind of keep going? They need bridge loans. We're doing that. So I imagine that everything that UNCDF is doing now, and frankly, again, despite the fact that people are working from their homes, we're still deploying these capabilities. So now reemergence, I think we're going to be continuing to be doing the same things, obviously in light of the repurposing that we had to do. So that's, I mean, I think we're going to continue leaning into our mission, again, with an eye towards helping countries not just move past COVID, but that they can be positioned to experience sustainable growth in the future. And I'll just very quickly, to build on Bo's point about the triple bottom line, what I'll be curious about coming out of reemergence is the blending of capital, and whether this will hopefully really be a golden age for blended finance, where concessional capital and commercial capital are coming together and driving impacts in the toughest geographies. It's happening generally. We haven't seen it make its way down into, make its way to the world's, the LDCs and the world's poorest countries. I would hope that coming out of reemergence, that becomes an arrow in the quiver.
That's outstanding. Does anyone have any, one last point? I don't really have to do much of a closing. I think you all have done an excellent job of representing yourselves. Any one piece of advice or one ask you have of the folks who end up watching this or reading this? And if you want to defer, you can defer. I didn't time a question, but is there one thing, one ask you wish you could make of the people watching this? To go first.
I would say think strategically. Like, this is the opportunity, build those relationships, and let's come to a common kind of view of what that new future looks like and work to get there.
Thanks, Greg. Anyone
else? Yeah, I think I'm going to say don't forget what you've learned during the indoor time. Like, I mean, from anything from like cooking, because people have never cooked before, but to those, like, a lot of people have had these really great existential reflections, and often you'll go on like a retreat for work or something, and then you leave and go back into the normal environment and you forget all that stuff. Like, yeah, my tip is like, take those with you and make sure we don't forget this moving forward when the next thing happens.
Yeah, I'll just repeat something that I heard one of our fellows say, Aijin Pu, and she basically was commenting on a moment of collective strength, and that sort of the era of the zero-sum game is over. And I think, I think a lot about sort of how can we collectively thrive in the future.
Great. Anything else? Anyone else?
I would like to add, I mean, I agree with all the comments. I think it's also like, we don't need to do everything. We don't need to solve everything. We don't need to carry the weight of the world in our shoulders. I think we all have our strengths as people and as organizations. And I think this is a time to really understand what we do best and how we can contribute. And I think this is going to be the best way to work together, just to build on all those strengths that either you discovered during this time or you were able to build on this time. So I think this is going to be, at the end of the day, what's going to help us solve this crisis, that it's not just a health crisis, it's from all ends of the spectrum. It has different types of consequences. So I think just having that in mind, that we don't need to solve every single issue, just focus on what you do best and then just build on that.
Great.
I'd love to build on that, because I completely agree. And I would just, I think we're all aware that the collection of solutions that we're going to need in order to address COVID, obviously a number of them are going to be innovative. They're going to be solutions that did not exist but for COVID. But there's also going to be a number of solutions that actually existed pre-COVID. And this just goes back to the point of repurposing. And frankly, that's not even just at an organizational level, it's at a personal level. Because I think we're all, not just as professionals, but as just humans, constantly wrestling with the question of how can I bring value at this point in time? And a lot of it is just going to rely on what you did before COVID. It's just a matter of repurposing. And so just remembering that the skills and capabilities and equities that made an organization successful and impactful are going to be very relevant during this time as well.
That's great. Thank you, folks. I mean, literally, the only thing I have left to say is thanks. Thanks for hopping on so quickly and sharing your thoughts so thoughtfully. I appreciate it. We will again, thanks to everybody who attended and stuck around to see the number hold steady throughout the hour. We appreciate that. We will be sharing the video so everyone has it and some takeaways. Other than that, thanks for attending. Thanks for indulging me with my fireside for the fireside chat. I appreciate it. And we appreciate you all. Thanks a lot. And everyone, please have a close to the week.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Stay well.
Stay
Thanks,
safe.
everyone. Take care.
Bye now.